My name is Odalys Pharaoh, and if I had believed in coincidences, I probably would have called my marriage a strange but lucky one. My husband was handsome, polished, and easy to talk to. He understood restaurants well enough to sound knowledgeable without ever sounding like a blowhard. He remembered the name of my grandmother on the first date, asked about the season we opened, and even knew enough to ask whether our city's liquor license waiting list had changed since the pandemic. At the time, I thought that last question meant he was attentive. I thought he was the kind of man who paid attention to the details that mattered to me. I thought he saw how hard I had fought for the life I built and admired it. What I eventually learned was that he had been studying the one weak point in my life, long before he ever sat across from me at a wine bar and asked what I wanted for my future. 18 months into my marriage, I found the paperwork proving my husband had researched my restaurant's liquor license transfer laws 3 weeks before he ever asked me on a first date. That sentence still makes my chest tighten, even now, because people hear liquor license and think it sounds like some dry, administrative detail, the kind of thing accountants or lawyers worry about. They do not picture the engine room of a woman's entire life. They do not picture the years of saving, the loan applications, the sleepless nights, the endless inspections, the humiliating calls to the city offices, the waiting list that moved slower than grief. They do not picture what it means to build a restaurant from nothing and realize that one permit, one signature, one act of quiet fraud could take the whole thing from you. I opened Marisol's 6 years ago. I named it after my grandmother, the woman who taught me to chop onions without crying, to keep my face calm when money was short, and to never let anyone confuse my kindness with weakness. She had raised me more like a co-conspirator than a child. She believed that women should know how to order from a contractor, balance a ledger, and say no without apologizing. When she passed, I promised myself I would build something with her name on it, something that could outlast all the people who had underestimated us. The storefront I bought was small. Just a narrow brick place on a street lined with older buildings that had been turned into coffee shops, boutiques, and a few restaurants that opened with a lot of hype and closed 3 years later when the rent climbed too high. The place I found had a crooked kitchen line, old wood floors, and windows that leaked cold air in winter, but it had the bones of a neighborhood restaurant if you knew how to look. I knew. I spent 4 years saving for the down payment and the renovation, working doubles at a hotel restaurant, taking private catering jobs on the side, and living in a tiny apartment where the heater rattled every night like a loose tray of silverware. The liquor license was the hardest part. In our city, they are limited. There is a cap on full licenses, and if you lose one, or if you are just unlucky and trying to start a place at the wrong time, you can wait years for a chance to get on the list. I spent 9 months on paperwork and hearings after I bought the building, and there were times I thought the whole dream would collapse under the weight of forms alone. Every question from the board felt like a trap. Every missing signature meant another month. Every rumor that a new license had become available sent my stomach into my throat. By the time I finally had it, I understood exactly what it represented. It was not just permission to serve wine with dinner or pour cocktails at the bar. It was survival. Our margins depended on it. Without alcohol sales, Marisol's would have been a charming little restaurant with a good reputation and a very narrow future. With it, I could pay staff decently, keep prices reasonable, and survive the slow months when the city emptied out and people only came in if they were celebrating or if they trusted us enough to make us part of a routine. I remember the day the license was approved. I stood in my empty dining room with the letter in my hand and cried so hard I had to sit on a stack of folded napkins on the floor behind the host stand. My grandmother's photo was still propped on the shelf near the register, and I swear I could hear her laughing at me for making such a scene over a piece of paper. But to me, that piece of paper meant every sacrifice I had made was finally paying off. That was the life Bastien walked into. I met him at an industry mixer 18 months before I found his paperwork. A mutual friend who ran a wine bar introduced us in the loud middle of a crowded room where everybody was pretending to be relaxed while scanning for the next useful connection. My friend Celia touched my elbow and said, "Odalys, this is Bastien. He sold the sandwich chain I told you about." Bastien smiled like he knew exactly how much room he occupied. He was not flashy in the way men sometimes are when they want to be noticed. He was quieter than that, which made him more dangerous in hindsight. He had tailored shirts, careful manners, and the kind of steady eye contact that made people feel chosen. He asked me what Marisol's was named after, how long I had been open, and what kind of crowd I got on weeknights versus weekends. Most men at mixers wanted to talk about their own success, their own plans, the size of their investments, or their opinions about the market. Bastian asked questions that sounded like respect. When I told him about the liquor license process, he leaned in with genuine interest and asked how long the waiting list had been. He even asked whether I had to renew the license annually or whether the transfer process was more complicated when the business changed hands. It felt like a flattering level of curiosity. He made it sound like he admired what I had built, and because I was tired, overworked, and lonely in a way I did not admit to myself, I liked the attention more than I should have. He told me he had recently sold a small chain of sandwich shops. He said he was looking to invest in something with more character, less formula, something rooted in a neighborhood instead of a strip mall. He talked about wanting a place with real identity. He listened while I talked about the menu, the regulars, and the stress of the lunch rush. He laughed in the right places. He was charming, but more importantly, he was careful. If I had known then how much carefulness can resemble sincerity, I might have saved myself years of pain. We started dating after that mixer. At first it was dinner once a week, then 2 or 3 times if our schedules lined up. He was attentive in ways that made my exhausted life feel lighter. He would show up with coffee on the mornings he knew I had an early supplier meeting. If I mentioned that a fryer was acting up, he sent over the number of a repair guy he claimed had helped his old shops. If a city inspection was scheduled, he asked thoughtful questions and listened to my complaints without trying to fix everything. He never made me feel stupid for the parts of the business I did not know. He made me feel capable. That mattered to me more than I want to admit. I was 37 and, despite the restaurant, still carrying some private shame that I was not more settled than other women my age. A lot of my friends were married, some with children, some with condos, some with careers that sounded stable in a way restaurants never are. My life was good, but it was precarious. Dating at that age made me cautious. I had had enough bad experiences to distrust fast charm, but Bastian moved at the pace that feels safe. He did not push for intimacy too quickly. He did not try to move into my apartment. He did not talk about forever on the second date. He seemed to understand that trust is something you build brick by brick. That was the story I told myself anyway. 8 months after we started dating, we got married. It was a small ceremony, the kind that looks intimate and lovely in photos but mostly happens because everyone is too busy to orchestrate anything bigger. We held it at a garden venue on the edge of town. My sister cried. Celia made a speech that had everyone laughing and then tearing up 5 seconds later. Bastian's parents were polite but distant, the sort of people who seem permanently aware of themselves in relation to class and status. I brushed that off because I wanted to. I wanted the marriage to feel like a joining of lives, not an audit of backgrounds. After the wedding, Bastian moved into an advisory role at Marisol's. That was the arrangement we agreed on. He had sold his old business interests, and I had enough on my plate that another competent adult in the room felt like a blessing. He handled vendor relationships, reviewed back-office logistics, and took over some ordering and bookkeeping tasks that had been eating too many of my hours. I was relieved to have help. Running a restaurant means your mind is always split in 10 directions. You are thinking about payroll while the soup is reducing, about reservations while a dishwasher calls out sick, about a produce delivery while you're trying to remember whether the alarm system was set. Bastian made himself useful. I will give him that. He was good at systems. He liked spreadsheets. He could keep up with numbers in a way that soothed the part of me that was always waiting for the next emergency. He suggested a better schedule for inventory rotation and negotiated a lower price on our seafood delivery by calling a supplier. I had not realized we could even reach directly. He seemed invested in making Marisol's run smoothly. In the beginning, I saw his involvement as proof he was committed to our life together. The first request about the license came 3 months after the wedding. We were in our kitchen at home, eating takeout over the sink, because we had both come in late and neither of us had the energy to sit properly at the table. He asked casually, almost as an afterthought, whether I had ever considered adding him as a co-licensee. I remember setting down my fork. He went on quickly, saying it was just a protection measure. He said if anything happened to me, the restaurant would need continuity. He said he hated the idea of my life's work becoming vulnerable because of an accident or a medical emergency. He framed it as estate planning, as practical love. He said he wasn't asking to control anything, just to make sure the license stayed active if I were ever incapacitated. He even said it would be easier for us with the state board if there were ever a change in ownership or if we wanted to expand. The request bothered me more than I was willing to say out loud. It was not because the idea was unreasonable in theory. It was because I had spent years fighting to get that license, and no one except me had borne the full weight of that fight. The city did not care about my marriage. The board did not care that I had a husband. They cared about qualifications, paperwork, and whether the wrong person wound up holding a license that could affect a business's entire future. I told him I wanted to think about it. He accepted that easily enough, which calmed me for a while. Looking back, I think that was part of how he worked. He never made a push look like a push. He made it look like a reasonable conversation, then waited for the ground to shift under your feet. Over the next months, he brought it up again and again, always gently. Once it was in the context of insurance. Once it was after a conversation about what would happen if one of us died suddenly. Once it was during a dinner with friends, when he laughed and said that in a real partnership, there should not be any mine and yours where the business is concerned. That comment lodged inside me more than the rest. It was said lightly, with a smile, but it made me think of my grandmother's warning. People who talk too much about fairness are often trying to hide a theft. Still, I did not refuse him outright. I hesitated. I delayed. I told myself that maybe I was being too protective, too suspicious, too shaped by the history of people taking advantage of women who had built something on their own. And because Bastien was patient, because he never exploded or insulted me when I said I needed time, I started to feel guilty for my caution. He had a way of making restraint feel like an accusation against him. So, 8 months into the marriage, I agreed to add him as a co-licensee. The process required both our signatures, joint ownership disclosure, and a stack of forms that I barely had the patience to read closely after a 12-hour shift. We filled them out in the office at Marisol's after close, with the dining room dark except for the glow from the exit sign and the kitchen light spilling onto the back hall. He handled the pen more than I did. He knew where to initial, what to check, what to mark. He had already prepared a packet with the forms tabbed and organized. He told me it would make things easier for the future. I remember him kissing my temple after I signed. At the time, I interpreted that kiss as relief. Now I think he kissed me because he had just gotten one step closer to what he wanted. For a while after that, nothing looked wrong. That is the cruelest part of this whole story. There was no dramatic moment when the air changed, no obvious slip, no sudden confession. My life went on the same way it had before. The staff still laughed in the kitchen. Regulars still came in for the lamb special and the old-fashioned cocktails. The dining room still smelled like seared garlic and rosemary on the nights we were slammed. Bastien still put his hand at the small of my back when we moved through crowded events. He still remembered to buy my favorite pears from the market. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings and texted me when he was going to be late. If I am honest, that normality is what made everything harder to detect. The first small signs were easy to rationalize. He started asking more specific questions about the liquor sales, which nights were strongest, whether the license was tied directly to me or to the business entity, whether it could be transferred quickly in the event of a separation. He said all of this in a tone that suggested curiosity, or maybe strategic caution. Sometimes he would mention people he knew in the industry who had been caught off guard by license issues after a divorce or a death, and he'd make it sound like he was simply trying to protect us from worst-case scenarios. I asked him once why he was so focused on the license, and he laughed and told me that because it was such a critical asset, it deserved special attention. He said he admired how hard I had worked for it. He said all the right things. Meanwhile, Marisol's was busy enough to distract me. We were reworking the menu for fall, training a new bartender, and dealing with an annoying landlord issue about the alley access behind the building. One of our ovens broke in the middle of a Friday service, and I spent 2 days managing staff with an online scheduling app while also trying to keep the review sites from spiraling over a delayed reservation. The restaurant is the kind of place that can make a person feel like she is always one emergency away from drowning. That is part of what makes success there feel so satisfying, but it is also what leaves a business owner vulnerable. You are so busy putting out fires that you assume the people closest to you are helping instead of setting one. 18 months into the marriage, I was looking for an old insurance document in our shared filing cabinet at home. We had turned the front room into a home office because both of us needed somewhere to keep records and sort through papers, and like most shared spaces, it had become a place where everything important and everything irrelevant got stacked together in equal measure. I was pulling out folders, muttering to myself because I could not find the policy statement, when I noticed a heavy manila folder tucked behind a stack of tax documents. It had the old business name of Bastien's sandwich chain written on the tab. I almost ignored it. That is what still haunts me. If I had been looking for the folder, maybe I would have been suspicious. Instead, I was just annoyed and impatient, and I opened it because I thought it might contain one of his old corporate insurance policies. Inside were printouts, not casual printouts, not harmless background material. They were organized, dated pages containing information about liquor license transfer laws in our city and the surrounding county. There were notes in the margins, there were paragraphs highlighted in yellow, there was a timeline, carefully written, that began 3 weeks before our first industry mixer. I read one page twice because I thought I had misunderstood it. The page described exactly what our city required for ownership changes in a licensed restaurant. The next sheet had handwritten notes referencing target acquisition, Marisol's, single female owner, no partners, license active 6 years. There was another note about timing, and one about how a co-licensee arrangement could create leverage if the target was already emotionally invested. There were even calculations about the difference between direct ownership and co-license authority. Those words were so cold and so clinical that I felt physically ill. They did not sound like a man researching a shared future. They sounded like a man evaluating a property. The dates were what broke something in me. 3 weeks before our first meeting. Not months after. Not after a business discussion. Not after he had organically learned about me. Before. He had researched how to take over my restaurant before he ever asked me on a first date. I sat on the floor of the office with the folder open in my lap and stared at the pages until my eyes hurt. I kept looking for some alternate interpretation, some innocent explanation I could use to keep my world intact. But the more I read, the more it looked like a plan. A patient, detailed, ugly plan. I did not confront him that day. Instead, I took pictures of every page with my phone. I made sure to capture the dates, the notes, the business name, and the highlighted sections. I put the folder back exactly where I had found it and closed the cabinet. Then I went into the kitchen, washed my hands slowly, and made dinner, as though my whole life had not just split open. I have never in my life felt so strange inside my own skin. That night I watched Bastien across the table and tried to see him as he really was. He talked about a supplier issue. He asked how my day had gone. He reached for my hand. Nothing in his face was obviously monstrous. That almost made it worse. A person who looks evil would be easier to survive. A person who looks affectionate while building a trap is harder. I did not sleep much that night. By morning, I had made a decision. If he wanted my trust destroyed, he would not get the satisfaction of watching me explode before I understood the full shape of what he had done. I called an attorney a fellow restaurant owner had recommended, a woman named Priscilla Nakamura. Her office was in a narrow downtown building above a dry cleaner, and when I sat across from her the next day, she did not waste time with sympathetic noises or vague encouragement. She was direct in the way competent people are direct. She asked me for facts. She asked me for dates. She asked me what I had in writing. I told her everything. I showed her the photos from my phone. Her expression changed only once, and it was subtle, but I saw it. She leaned back and said, very quietly, that the way the research was organized suggested intentional planning rather than casual interest. Then she asked me whether Bastien had ever had access to the licensing documents or to the state board portal. I said yes, because he had handled some administrative tasks and because I had trusted him. Priscilla nodded as if that confirmed something she already suspected. She said the first thing we needed to do was determine whether he had already filed anything. That was the moment I realized how much worse this could be than simple betrayal. If he had already submitted a change request, then I had not just married the wrong man. I had given him access to the one thing that kept my restaurant legally alive. Priscilla pulled the actual filing history with the State Alcohol Beverage Control Board. I remember sitting in her office while she called in a way only lawyers seem able to do, one foot on the floor, pen in hand, voice calm and precise. Every minute that passed felt like a slow cracking sound in my chest. When she finally hung up, she looked at me and told me that 2 months earlier, Bastien had quietly filed an amendment requesting sole licensee status. I had to ask her to repeat it. He had claimed in the filing that I had voluntarily stepped back from active management due to a health-related leave of absence. He had attached a doctor's note. There was a kind of roaring silence in my head after that. I could hear the office air conditioner. I could hear someone talking in the hallway outside. I could hear the tiny click of Priscilla's pen against the table, but it felt like I had left my body and was watching someone else absorb the news. The note, Priscilla said, did not come from any physician listed in the state licensing database. The name on the letterhead did not match an actual practice. The license number was fake. Whoever created it had done just enough work to make it appear legitimate at a glance and not enough to withstand an actual verification. The amendment was still pending review because the board had a backlog. That part may have been the only reason I did not lose my entire restaurant. If the review had been processed quickly, Bastien would have become the sole named licensee. That would have given him legal standing over the license. And once you understand how dependent a restaurant is on that one document, you understand why I felt like the floor had just dropped out beneath me. It was not just the ability to serve cocktails, it was the leverage to push me out of the business I had built. It was the power to say I was no longer necessary. Priscilla did not let me panic for long. She was too practical for that. She told me not to confront him yet. I wanted to. God, I wanted to walk home that second and throw the folder and the phone pictures in his face and watch his expression change. But she said that if I confronted him before we had more information, he could withdraw the request, deny everything, and claim it had all been a misunderstanding. Then I would have suspicion but no proof. If he knew I was onto him, he would clean up the trail. So I waited. Those 10 days were some of the hardest of my life. I still had to go to the restaurant with him every night. I still had to answer staff questions and approve invoices and smile at regulars who came in for dinner and had no idea that my marriage was rotting inside a sealed folder in my house. I still had to hand him the till at closing. I still had to listen while he joked with the bartender and asked whether I wanted tea before bed. I still had to let him kiss me goodnight. Every time he touched me during those days, I had the absurd sensation that I was being used as camouflage for a crime. Priscilla and I used the time wisely. She started by confirming every detail of the filing history. She pulled the amendment request, the attachment files, the timestamps, and the board's internal notes. Then she asked me for any other records that might help establish motive and pattern. I gave her access to what I had. She told me to keep acting normally and to write down any conversation about the restaurant, the license, or my health that might seem relevant. I started a private note on my phone with times and quotes. It felt paranoid at first, then it felt necessary. Bastian kept asking whether I had been to the doctor for my recurring migraines, because he said I had looked tired lately. He asked whether maybe I should slow down at the restaurant and let him take on even more. He mentioned, twice, that if I ever needed to take a break, he could manage everything. He said it with a smile and a hand on my lower back, as if he were offering devotion instead of taking inventory of my weakness. The more I listened, the more those comments sounded rehearsed. During that same period, Priscilla brought in a private investigator named Marisol Vance. I will never forget that her name matched my restaurant. It felt almost eerie when she introduced herself, but she was unfazed by my reaction. She was tall, direct, and the kind of person who notices everything without making a show of noticing. Priscilla said she trusted her for business asset cases and licensing disputes because she knew how to dig into public records without setting off unnecessary alarms. Marisol asked me what I knew about Bastian's past. I told her about the sandwich shops, the marriage, and the polished image he had sold me. I told her what little he had said about his first business. She took notes and said she would start by tracing the corporate records, his name variations, and any prior litigation. I had not realized that someone could make a business partner and a detective feel like equally necessary roles in a marriage until that week. Marisol's findings came back slowly at first, then all at once. She discovered that Bastian had, under a slightly different version of his name, been involved in 2 prior civil disputes in another state. Both involved small business owners. Both women ran licensed establishments. Both had married him within a year of meeting him. Both had later filed for divorce after disputes over business assets. The details were not clean enough to read like a crime report, which is what made them so alarming. There were settlements. There were confidentiality clauses. There were vague references in filings to irreconcilable disagreements and management concerns. There were no criminal charges. Nothing dramatic had ever made the news. But when Marisol laid the cases out side by side, the pattern was unmistakable. Different women, different restaurants, same kind of relationship arc, same pressure around business control. The hair on my arm stood up when I saw the timeline. In one case, the divorce was filed after the husband had requested control over a permit renewal. In the other, the wife had discovered that he had been inserted into operating paperwork right before a major expansion. One woman had agreed to settle privately to avoid dragging her restaurant's reputation through court. The other had said in a deposition, according to Marisol, that she felt like she had been managed into submission. Priscilla did not say anything for a while after reading those files. Then she asked Marisol to look deeper into the sandwich shop chain. That, too, produced something ugly. Bastian's actual business history was not as self-made and straightforward as he liked to imply. The sandwich chain had been sold after a business partner bought him out in what court records described in polite, sterile language as irreconcilable management disagreements. The partner, Marisol discovered, had held the alcohol permit for the chain before the sale. The pattern was there again, hidden behind business language and private settlements. Bastian had a history of moving toward control of whatever asset he believed made a business vulnerable. I felt sick when Priscilla told me. I kept thinking about all the moments I had interpreted as intimacy. The questions, the interest, the way he leaned in when I talked about licenses or paperwork, the way he had positioned himself as someone who understood business risk. He had not been sharing concern with me. He had been learning the architecture of my vulnerability. I asked Marisol very quietly whether she thought he had really married me for the license. She looked at me like she had been waiting for me to ask that question and said, "I think he married a business model that happened to come with a wife." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I sat in the office chair and stared at the wall because it was easier than looking at the paper in front of me. Priscilla said we needed to confront him carefully. By then, the case had become large enough that the confrontation needed to be strategic, not emotional. She arranged for a morning meeting at the restaurant before opening, when the dining room would be empty and staff would not be around to overhear. She wanted all of us present, me, her, and if possible the most complete documentary record we could assemble. That Tuesday morning felt like walking toward an execution chamber in daylight. Bastian arrived exactly on time. He wore a navy shirt and the expression of a man who expected to discuss routine business. He looked mildly puzzled when he saw Priscilla, but not alarmed. He asked if there was a problem. We sat in my back office at the small round table where I usually reviewed invoices and vendor menus. Priscilla had spread out the evidence in front of us. There were printed copies of the initial folder pages, the dated research notes, the state filing record, and the fabricated doctor's note. There were also the private investigator's summaries of the prior cases, though those were marked clearly as background information to be verified through discovery if needed. I watched Bastian's eyes move over the table. He smiled at first, but I could see him calculating. Priscilla let me begin. I told him I had found the folder. I told him I knew he had been researching my liquor license before we met. I told him I knew about the amendment he filed 2 months earlier. My voice sounded steady, but inside I was shaking so hard I thought my hands might lift off the table. He denied it immediately. Not aggressively, not yet. He laughed a little and said I was taking things out of context. He said he had always been interested in licensing because of his own prior businesses. He said the notes were part of a general business exploration. He said I must have misunderstood the documents. Priscilla did not argue. She simply pushed the amendment paperwork toward him and asked whether he wanted to explain the health-related leave statement. The smile disappeared. He said I had been exhausted lately, that we had discussed me taking time off, that he had only tried to protect the business if my health declined. He claimed the note was from a physician I had seen, and that perhaps the board had not updated its database correctly. Then Priscilla read the license number aloud and told him calmly that the physician did not exist in any state medical licensing database. That was the first time he looked directly at me with real anger. It changed him in front of my eyes. He stopped looking like the charming husband I thought I knew and started looking like a stranger forced into a corner. He accused me of spying on him. He asked how I dared go through his private paperwork. He said I was paranoid, controlling, and unfair. He said I was humiliating him. I remember staring at him and feeling something inside me go very still. The thing about betrayal is that once it is exposed, the cheater often acts as though the exposure is the original sin. That was what he did. He did not say, "You caught me doing something terrible." He said, "How could you invade my privacy?" Priscilla let him talk himself tired. Then Marisol's findings were placed on the table. 2 prior marriages, 2 licensed businesses, a pattern of asset disputes, the sandwich shop buyout, the repeated interest in licenses and ownership structures. The same kind of pressure, over and over again, dressed up in different stories. He went silent when he realized this was not just me guessing, this was documented. He tried one more tactic, and I will never forget the coldness of it. He told me that I was overreacting because I was afraid of being alone, that I was turning a practical business arrangement into a personal attack, that women like me sometimes mistake control for love because we are used to carrying everything ourselves. I was so stunned I could not speak for a second. Priscilla, however, could. She told him that if he wished to challenge the evidence, he could do so in court, but that the filing history, the forged note, and the prior pattern of behavior made the matter very serious. She told him that the board could be notified immediately and that any attempt to further alter the license would likely be considered fraud. That finally made him look afraid. Not remorseful. Afraid. He did not confess in any meaningful way. He never sat there and said, "Yes, I planned this from the beginning." People like him rarely hand over a clean admission if they can help it. But he stopped denying the amendment. He stopped insisting the physician was real. He stopped talking as though this had all been a misunderstanding. In the world of legal disputes, silence can sometimes say more than confession, and that silence was enough. Priscilla filed the objection that same day. The formal complaint went to the Alcohol Beverage Control Board with a full packet of evidence: the fraudulent amendment request, the fake medical documentation, the licensing history, and the timeline establishing that he had been researching transfer rules before our relationship began. The board moved immediately to review it as a fraud matter. Priscilla explained that submitting a falsified physician's note to a state authority was not a trivial mistake. It was the kind of thing that could trigger sanctions, and in some cases criminal referral. I had to keep functioning while all of this moved forward. That was the strange part. The city did not stop because my life was collapsing. I still had a restaurant to run. The staff still needed schedules. The food orders still had to go out. The dinner reservations still filled up on Friday nights. I was forced to keep answering questions from my sous chef about whether we should feature the duck special while privately wondering whether my husband would come home and pretend to be sorry or angry or both. He left the restaurant after the confrontation and did not return until late that night. He told me he needed space. He slept in the guest room. I slept with my phone beside the bed and the door locked. The next few days were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and the peculiar grief of talking about your own marriage as though it were a hostile contract. Priscilla moved fast. She filed additional protective paperwork to ensure Bastian could not use his co-licensee status to interfere while the board reviewed the fraud claim. She also began the divorce process immediately, because we both understood that any hope of salvaging the marriage had been destroyed the moment he turned my business into a target. I did not cry much in front of anyone during that time. I think I had already cried most of the tears I had. What hurt most was how much of our life had been built around my trust. We had shared holiday dinners, we had gone on trips. He knew my staff's names, he had listened to stories about my grandmother, he had stood in my dining room and told me he admired what I had built. I had believed him, or more accurately, I had wanted to believe him badly enough to ignore my instincts. The board's investigation moved quickly because the evidence was so clean. The amendment was frozen, the license remained in my name. The fact that the doctor did not exist made the note impossible to defend as a clerical error. Priscilla framed the issue in a way that left the board little room to be passive. If they ignored it, they would be tolerating fraud in a process designed to protect public trust. Within days, I was informed that Bastian's request for sole licensee status had been denied. The relief I felt was not triumphant. It was closer to relief after a flood has stopped rising. Your house is still damaged, your furniture is still ruined, but the water is no longer coming in. Priscilla then structured the divorce settlement with a level of precision that made me appreciate why people pay lawyers as much as they do. The marriage was short enough and the evidence of fraud strong enough that my position was significantly better than it might have been otherwise. We made sure the restaurant and its liquor license remained entirely mine. There was no question of him claiming business partnership rights. There was no ambiguity about ownership. Everything was documented, filed, and protected. Bastian tried, through his attorney, to argue that the co-license arrangement had been consensual and that he had simply been trying to secure the business's continuity. That argument would have carried some weight if he had not simultaneously submitted a fake doctor's note and lied about my health status. Priscilla responded by presenting the timeline, the notes, and the prior case pattern. His side stopped pushing after that. The district attorney's office did review the matter. I learned that when Priscilla called to tell me that the board had referred the fraudulent note for possible criminal scrutiny. For a few days I thought maybe he would actually face charges. I did not know how to feel about that. Part of me wanted the system to name what he had done in the clearest possible terms. Another part of me was already tired and wanted the situation to be over more than it wanted revenge. In the end, the district attorney declined to pursue criminal charges. They cited limited resources and the fact that the fraudulent amendment had not actually been processed or caused direct financial harm before it was stopped. I was furious when I heard that, but Priscilla was not surprised. She said that in white-collar and fraud matters, especially when the harm has been interrupted before completion, prosecutors often make ugly cost-benefit decisions. That did not mean he got away with it. The board permanently flagged Bastian's name in its internal fraud database. That effectively barred him from holding a liquor license anywhere in the state going forward. For a man who had built his career around attaching himself to business assets through legal structures and personal relationships, that was not a small consequence. It was a wall. He tried one last time to negotiate around the edges in settlement discussions, but there was nowhere for him to go. He could not touch the restaurant, he could not claim the license, he could not keep the leverage he had tried to build. By the time the divorce was finalized, the law had already moved him out of my life. Emotionally, though, it was not that clean. There are practical consequences, and then there is the wreckage in your own head. For weeks, I woke up at odd hours wondering whether I had missed earlier signs. I replayed the first dates, the questions he asked, the moments when he seemed to show the deepest interest in the least romantic parts of my life. I started to understand how predators often do not burst into your life as obvious threats. They arrive as tailored reassurance. They study what you care about and reflect it back at you. I also had to deal with the embarrassment of being married to someone who had seen me as an opportunity. That shame sat close to the surface for a while, especially when people who knew us vaguely asked what happened. I was careful about what I said because gossip spreads quickly in restaurant circles, and I did not want Marisol's to become a spectacle. I told people we were divorcing and left it at that. My sister was angry on my behalf in a way that helped me breathe. "He used your kindness against you," she said one night while we were closing the dining room together. "That's not your failure, that's his character." I repeated that to myself often because I needed to. The restaurant staff noticed that something was wrong, of course, even though I tried to keep the drama away from them. You cannot look someone in the eye every day for years without them sensing when your movements have changed. A few of the older servers asked whether I was all right. I said yes. One of the line cooks, who had worked with me long enough to know when to stop asking questions, simply made me an extra cup of coffee and set it on the prep table without comment. That small gesture nearly undid me. Marisol, the investigator, continued digging after the divorce because she was curious and because she had a professional habit of finishing the map once she started drawing it. She found that Bastien had moved to another state within 4 months. According to public records, he had already remarried. When she told me, I felt a strange mix of nausea and vindication. Part of me was horrified that he had moved on so quickly. Part of me was not surprised at all. People like Bastien do not like sitting in the debris of their own behavior. They keep traveling until they find a new person willing to mistake their competence for character. I did not wish his new wife harm. I only wished she had better information than I did. A month after the divorce, Priscilla and I met one final time to close out the case. She reviewed the board's final actions and told me that the fraud flag was permanent. She also gave me a practical warning I have never forgotten. She said that people often protect bank accounts, titles, deeds, and retirement accounts with obsessive care, but they hand over access to licenses, company structures, and other administrative assets without thinking twice. That is exactly where the danger lives. If it took you years to build, she said, treat it like a vault. That line stuck with me. I kept my grandmother's restaurant. I kept her name on the sign. I kept the staff who had helped me build a reputation from scratch. I kept the regulars who came in every Thursday for the same bottle of wine and the lamb special and told me they trusted us because the place still felt like family. More importantly, I kept the thing Bastien had never understood. Marisol's was not just a business. It was the material form of all the years I had survived before anyone called me successful. The first night after everything was settled, I stood in the dining room after close and looked at the reflections in the dark windows. The tables were empty, the chairs were stacked, the bar was quiet. For a long time I simply listened to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint clatter of someone cleaning in the kitchen. It felt like the whole building was breathing with me. I thought about my grandmother then. I thought about how she would have handled Bastien. I think she would have seen through him much earlier than I did, but she would not have blamed me for what he tried. She would have reminded me that trust is not foolishness. The fault lies with the person who turns trust into an access point. I also thought about how many women are taught to doubt themselves when they sense something is wrong. We are told not to be dramatic, not to assume the worst, not to make a scene. We are told that patience is virtuous and suspicion is unattractive. Bastien counted on that. He counted on me explaining away the discomfort, softening the obvious, and waiting until it was too late. The part that still angers me is how well he understood that pressure. But he underestimated what happens when a woman decides to stop being polite about her own survival. I did not get my power back in one dramatic instant. It returned piece by piece. It came back when I started making decisions without checking whether someone else would approve. It came back when I signed vendor contracts and knew exactly whose name was on them. It came back when I sat down with Priscilla and read every business filing line by line, because I would never again hand over paperwork I had not studied. It came back when I stopped feeling guilty for being careful. People sometimes ask, in a more discreet way than they think, whether I regretted marrying him. The honest answer is complicated. I regret that I trusted him. I regret that he got access to the license. I regret the years of my life spent loving someone who was studying how to take from me. But I do not regret learning what I learned, because it changed the way I protect myself. It changed the way I think about ownership, partnership, and the stories people tell when they want your guard down. I have never once regretted this rule. Any asset that took me years to build stays in my name alone, no matter how loving or patient the person asking to share it seems. That rule is not bitterness, it is architecture. And if you have ever built something with your own hands, you know exactly what I mean. There are still nights at Marisol's when I catch myself scanning a table of strangers and wondering what stories they are carrying into my dining room. I do not do that because I am afraid of everyone. I do it because I have learned that some threats come in smiling. Some people ask the right questions for the wrong reasons. Some men are not looking for love at all, but for access, leverage, and a way to enter your life through the side door. I wish I could say the experience made me colder. It did not. I am still warm with my staff, still generous with regulars, still sentimental about the way a good meal can bring people together. What changed is that my softness now has borders.
And Bastian? He became exactly what he deserved to become, a man whose name is permanently marked by the state board that once would have let him erase me. He can no longer hold the license he tried to steal. He can no longer use that channel to slide into another restaurant owner's life the way he tried to slide into mine. That may not be the kind of ending people expect from a story like this, but it is the ending I earned. I kept the restaurant, I kept the license, I kept the name my grandmother gave me in spirit, and the one she helped me build in fact. He thought he was marrying a path to ownership. What he actually married was the woman who would make sure he never got it.
If this story kept you hooked, share it with someone who'd love a good betrayal story like this one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel is all about stories like mine, the people we trust most, and the moments that quietly change everything. There's another story coming soon. Until then, trust the paperwork over the performance, and I'll see you in the next story.